great conference. Really excited to have everybody still here after all this amazing food for thought that you've had delivered to you today. And I'm really excited about this panel. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the present and sort of some of the science involved in that, and then we're going to look into the future, and we're going to finish about, I think, 30 years out. So let's get started. So I'm Josh McHugh, as Garrett mentioned, CEO of Attention Span, editor-in-chief of Attention Forward, and we work with sports, healthcare, and food companies to help them chart a path to their future. So without more about me, I think that's about it for the rest of the panel, if everything goes well. Let's start off with John. John Ghingo, president of Applegate. Very interesting career. Started in advertising. Came through Kraft, Heinz, and Mondelez, which is what that became, and then, or the other way around, and then ended up at White Wave running a bunch of different brands, including Silk, before becoming president at Applegate. Beth, fantastic to have you here. I'm amazed that you made it with all the press throngs that must have chased you around after you got the Innovator of the Year award as the head of Boston College Dining Services, and that's not by any means the only award you've won since you got there in 2014. Is that right?
Yep, 5 years.
Okay, 5 years, and before that, I think going way back, you were with Aramark and worked on a lot of their K-12 and higher education jobs. That's okay. I'm still with it. And all right. And then I designated Todd to be our scary futurist today. It's usually my job, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say today. A CEO and co-founder of Hungry Planet, coming from kind of left field, but meaning that you were in technology before you got into the food space, technology and manufacturing, I believe. Okay, coming the other way down the line, can each of you point back to a moment or an event in your careers where it may have been sort of a turning point, but something that you can trace back to orienting you onto the path that led you to this moment?
Sure. I guess that starts with me. I think my journey towards being in the food industry, my background is as a serial entrepreneur and as an impact investor. And my first exposure to food was back, in terms of a business, was back in the early 90s, where I went to Ukraine and ended up exporting sunflower seeds out of Ukraine. Then I was an early investor in Honest Tea. And through all that, I was convinced that wasn't really where I wanted to spend my time, so I went into tech. But I've eaten plant-based for 25 years. And back in 2004, with some other folks, we came to the conclusion that what we really need to do is to figure out how to perfectly mimic conventional meat by taking plant proteins and instead of putting them through animals, create essentially the same product. So that was kind of what brought me to the point where I am now, and I'm working on this on a full-time basis.
So I've been feeding students for a long time, but it really was in the last probably 8 years, I realized the power that the students have in helping you make change. And the more that I got the students involved in our strategic planning and our ideation, the more likely we were going to be able to implement. And so the key piece really in the last 5 years in this space has been growing students, sustainability student interns on campus working directly for dining, in the office coming up with all of these things that we've been talking about today, and how can we do it, and then they getting the other student groups on campus involved and really making an impact, and then doing more peer-to-peer discussion about it versus hearing from me.
John?
Good afternoon. So I would say probably for me there were two pivotal moments. When I started, I guess when I was a kid, really, I worked in restaurants growing up, and I enjoyed it, a lot of fun. I liked the action, I liked the food, but then I thought I wanted to go into business. So I went into, as Josh mentioned, advertising, marketing communications, copywriting, that kind of work, and it was really interesting as well. But it was when I came back to food and started working on a big food company account as an advertising person that I realized I really wanted to get back into food and do food. And so that was one. The second was, I spent my career then working for Nabisco, Kraft Foods, Mondelez International, so big global companies with great brands. And when I moved over to natural and organic food and call it more sustainable food, that was a big moment for me as well. And I did that out of purpose. I also did it out of excitement, because that really is where the change was happening. The change in the industry, the change for the world was going to happen in the natural, organic, sustainable food space. So that was a big pivot and leap for me as well. And that kind of brought me back here to Applegate, where the company has been around for 31 years. The mantra has been around for 31 years. It's changing the meat we eat. And change is not easy, but it makes things exciting and meaningful every day.
Awesome. Well, I want to kick it off by talking about something super futuristic, which is dirt. As a technology reporter at Forbes and Wired, I spent a lot of time following what Bill Gates was saying and doing, and recently he posted an article on his blog about dirt, about soil, and so just to kick this thing off on a real highbrow note, we'll quote Bill Gates at the beginning of this article. He says, "I am done with cow farts." So his point is that in the discussion of sustainability and the future of the food industry, the thing that's really been missed is an examination of soil, taking care of the soil's role. Love to get a quick take from each of you on it, and I want to start with Beth on that, because I know that a lot of your time has been spent doing farm inspections with and for students.
Well, it was a long time ago, but when I first met David Davidson, who's the director of dining here at Harvard, he was at Yale, and I was working for Aramark, and the Yale Sustainable Project was starting, and one of my responsibilities was to actually inspect the farms to ensure that the food that we were going to serve at Yale was safe. And as it relates to plant protein and soil, the interest and desire of students to eat more plant-based has certainly increased over the last 5 years. And, the legumes, the lentils are certainly much better for the soil and more regenerative for the soil. So that's been something that we need to educate students more about, so that they know when they're choosing that it's a good, healthy option, but it's also good for the environment.
Super. John, what do you think about soil? Where do we need to go with it?
So great topic. It's something we've been talking a lot about. I do have one more soil quote. It's a little more highbrow than yours, but I'll go. So this is a quote from Paul Harvey. We talk about this at Applegate, and I like it, which is why I wanted to share it, because I knew we'd be talking about soil. So Paul Harvey, I'm not going to imitate him. He would do this much better than I will, but I'll say it. Man, despite his artistic pretensions, his sophistication, and his many accomplishments, owes his existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. It's that simple. And someone earlier today, a gentleman, spoke very passionately about soil, and I think points well made. We do really need to take care of our soil, and in a lot of the conversations we're having, we do lose sight of the soil. You can have a plant-based system, you can have an animal-based system. If you don't take care of the soil, it really doesn't matter. And so everything from what we put in the soil in terms of pesticides, glyphosates, what we do to rotate crops as opposed to monocropping, and how we're kind of draining soil over time. The UN projects, the scientists at the UN, that we will be out of soil in 60 years. 95% of our food comes from soil today. So it's a real dire situation. One of the things that we have been working on, which is a part of the answer, but again, it's going to take a lot of different pieces, but is regenerative agriculture, and not just sustaining the land, but actually replenishing the soil, rotating crops, rotating animals, having a system that actually can go ahead and get the soil in better, more measurably, demonstrably improved soil health, meaning it can sequester more carbon, retain more water, and has more biodiversity. So I think it's a huge topic. I think we're just at the beginning of really dealing with it, and I think many of the other answers we have in the food system will come back around with soil health.
Fantastic. Todd, what do you think? Give us something on soil.
So I would mirror some of these thoughts here. When we've looked at soil and the 6 inches of topsoil, the data that we've come across is that we've lost about 70% of that already. And so whether it's 60 years or we've heard 60 harvests left, that isn't a whole lot. And in some parts of the world, we're down to about 20 harvests. So I think you're Mr. Soil, as I recall. Those are the numbers that we've been hearing. And we find that really a big concern. The other data point that we've been working off of is that our understanding is it takes nature about 1,000 years to create about 3 centimeters of soil. So that's not going to happen in our lifetimes. We're not going to replace the 70% that we've lost. So we've got to figure out how best to use that soil in the most effective way within our supply chain. One of the other things that has really been of interest to me is when you look at how we've been applying pesticides and herbicides to increase yields. Some of the data that we've seen there is that about 40% of all that's been applied over the past 60 years hasn't actually been absorbed into plants. So it's runoff, and it creates these dead zones in our oceans and our seas. And so trying to find a way to really be good stewards of our soils and make sure that the pesticides and the herbicides that we apply are being precisely applied and are being minimally applied, and we're just adopting our practices so that we're not degrading this faster than we should be.
Thank you. That's kind of sobering stuff. For something completely different, I was having conversations with each of you in advance of this conference, and I heard a term pop up a few times, and I'm from California, and it sounded vaguely familiar, but I don't think I had really heard it before. It sounded like the name of a yoga cult or something, and the word is flexitarian. And so, John, can you explain for us what a flexitarian is?
Sure. So, the heart of it, the flex, is between animals and plants. And, there is a population of vegan consumers, obviously vegetarian consumers, but still relatively low numbers in terms of low single digits % of the population. But increasingly more and more consumers do want to incorporate more plants into their diets. And so what they're doing is they're flexing back and forth from meat, animal-based and plant-based diet, and that can mean all different things to all different people in terms of how they interpret that. Some of them will actually identify themselves as flexitarians, they'll use the word, but sometimes it's just catching the trend and kind of seeing how they're behaving. And it may have to do with the diet they're moving from or to, or the time of year that they're in. But the important part about it is they are looking to incorporate more plants, but people are still very much in love with a lot of their animal-based products, whether it's dairy products or meat products that they want to have as a part of their life as well.
Bacon.
Like bacon.
Bacon. Beth, you're on campus. Are you encountering flexitarians in the wild?
So we are not using the word flexitarian so much on campus, but there's definitely been an increase over the last 5 years, demand for more plant-based options. And a challenge that I know my colleagues here at Harvard and Maureen from Northeastern have faced is that most of our cooks know how to cook animal protein, and they don't know how to prepare. For example, they don't know the best way to manage quinoa, or they don't know the best way to cook lentils, legumes. So we've been doing a lot more work in that area in terms of culinary training because there has been a demand. But one thing that's not really selling is, and we haven't decided yet, We have the vocal vegan and vegetarian, so it is a good group of students, and they're asking, but it's a small group. If we start labeling things vegan and vegetarian, it is turning off some of the meat eaters. And even though the meat eaters are picking lots more plant-based options and they're making those choices, we're trying to be very careful about how we market it and giving them customizable options so that they can come to a station and they can get a vegan option, a bowl, let's just say a grain bowl, but if they want animal protein, small amount on top, or they want something else on top, they can ask.
Got it. Todd, you're a, I don't want to say it's a startup might undersell the amount of work that's gone into Hungry Planet to get you to the point you're at, but you're in growth mode right now, and I'm sure you've got projections and an awesome business plan. How does the flexitarian fit into that business plan?
So they are core to what we're about. So I think the numbers indicate that there are about 80 million people in the United States that are flexitarians. But we find that there are huge numbers across the planet. So as we've been rolling out our foods, we find that all those ex-vegans and vegetarians, and there are a lot of them out there, there's about an 80% churn over a 3-year period of those people who try to be vegan and vegetarians. So there are a lot of ex-vegans and vegetarians that kind of constitute a good portion, I think, of this flexitarian population. Our food is directly calibrated both to them as well as to omnivores and carnivores, right? So that is our target market, and that we find that there are significant amounts of those people that exist virtually everywhere. I mean, we're already selling our products to Australia, New Zealand. We've just had containers arrive in Hong Kong. So everywhere on the planet, there are people who are interested in eating slightly differently, really great food. And at the end of the day, that's what it's got to be about. And I think that's why a lot of people, while they try to be vegan and vegetarian, they gave it up because the food choices seem so limited. And when
also bacon.
Well, we haven't perfected that one yet, but it's coming. So yeah, I mean, there are huge numbers out there, and Veggie Grill, which is a client of ours, which is the largest plant-based restaurant concept in the country, they have about 40 locations. They publicly have shared that about 80% of their customers are not vegan or vegetarian. So it really has become a mainstream way of eating out there, and we just see the demand taking off very rapidly.
Very cool. So real quick, because I think this is actually more generally known, but this is a real big week for plant-based proteins. There were some big announcements in the news. In 30 seconds or less, I'd like each of your takes on the news this week about major restaurant groups starting to offer plant-based options.
So, yeah, I mean, Impossible Burger, big news this week with Burger King. I think it speaks to the fact that the consumer trend is big. These are big brands, big franchises going after the space. I had mentioned to you, Josh, earlier, we just launched a product in the past month that we debuted at the Natural Products Expo, which is a blend burger, which is blended beef, mushroom, and turkey mushroom. More than 30% mushrooms in the product. What that does is a substantial reduction to fat, to calories, so better nutritionals, less meat in the product, more plant, but it's a very clean product. So it's 3 simple ingredients. That's it. Organic beef, organic mushrooms, and organic rosemary. So our consumers are still telling us animals are important, meat is important, but we are thinking about it. We're being very conscious about the meat we're choosing, how it's being raised and sourced, how much of it we're having, and the impact. And we still want clean food. So that, I think, is one of the questions that's still to be wrestled through with some of these alternatives is Impossible Burger meat-free. What does the ingredient list look like? What is the nutritional impact on your body? And what is the true impact on the environment? I think there's still a lot to work through, but it does speak to the underlying trend as a very big one.
Beth?
And students are asking those questions about Impossible Burger. Is it healthier? What's the resources? They want to know. But certainly blended burgers have been big for a while. Many universities are serving them. We only serve those in one of our largest dining locations. We have had students, as part of their environmental science classes and part of the Menu of Change University Research Collaborative, done research across the country on that. We had a couple BC students that tested all sorts of blended meatballs and did it with focus groups in the dining halls. So they're talking about it, we're serving it, we're always looking at new options, we're always taste testing. I think it's only going to continue to increase.
To the man who gave us many of us our first plant-based meatball today here at the Food Impact Summit, what's your take?
To me, it's terribly exciting, right? It's educating everybody that there's this whole new category of food that's out there. So while we started our research, our R&D on this in 2004, and then started a pilot rolling this out in 2017 and 2018, we've seen that type of reception in everything from fine dining steakhouses to public K-12 schools and universities and everything across the board. Part of our mission as a business is to support underserved communities. And so while we haven't launched with a Burger King, in the past year we did over 1 million meals in public K-12 through our foundation that we've set up to support the underserved communities. And
were those all over the country or in one?
We focused in Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, where those schools have between 80 and 95% free and reduced meals. And what we found was when it's delicious food and it's nutritious, people just love it. So we served over 1 million meals, and we didn't have a single complaint from any student, any parent, any family, any faculty member, because the food was delicious, it was prepared well, and they just received it and they just loved what we were doing. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens when it's at fast food across the country, whether that same thing happens. But we found that in virtually every venue, people are ready for these types of foods.
It's really surprising how fast it feels. Like, I mean, not to you because you've been on the case for 15 years, but to even somewhat well-educated consumers, it feels like, wow, there are so many options all of a sudden. It's fascinating. So, want to get into transparency. Beth, you mentioned earlier that that students, even if something is, say, an Impossible Burger, they're not totally, necessarily sold just because it's called plant-based or, eventually possibly cell-based or cultured. But can you talk a little bit a bit more about that and that desire for transparency and what it means for food services in not just in college, but for everything.
Yes, certainly university students and K-12, well, the university students are the Gen Zs, are digital natives, so they're used to looking everything up and wanting to know about where everything comes from and the story. And, several people have talked about that today. And it's challenging. I think when you're in our settings, and this is K-12 too, your menu's changing every day. It's not like you're a quick service restaurant where your menu is pretty much solid, so you can tell people about each product. It's much more challenging in these large institutions where you have the variety to be able to give all of that information. And we're all pushing our vendors to give us that because students are screaming for it and really expect us to have it and want it on their phone, or they want it on the digital signage. They want to know everything about what they're eating. So it's going to be a challenge, but because they're asking for it, students have a lot of influence and power. Sure, they're only with us 4 years, but then they become the innovators and the business folks. It's going to happen, and hopefully sooner versus later.
John?
I mean, I think it's, again, early in the curve of what true transparency is and what the especially younger consumers are expecting and going to be sort of demanding of the system. I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on the system so that we can give the transparency. The two parts to it are information, and then the other part of it is it understandable information, right? And I think the food system is very complicated, right? And as you work more in it and you get more familiar with it, it doesn't necessarily get easier. Sometimes it gets more complicated.
How's your blockchain game?
Well, I think blockchain could be a huge enabler, an answer, right, in the end. I think the ideal situation we'll get to with consumers is where they can pick up a package of, I'll use one of our products as an example, ham, and they can see from the package and the information that's on the package, maybe they scan it, whatever it is, go all the way back to what breed of pig was it, what farm was the pig raised on, what were their animal welfare standards on that farm, where was the pig processed, when did that happen, and how did it get here? And I think that ultimately is doable. I think it's going to require technology and breakthrough, but I think that's what's going to be demanded. I think that will drive more change than anything else, because then I think it's going to just make that whole loop a lot closer and really get at the heart of some of these issues, which is what are people willing to pay, for standards, whether it's environmental, whether it's animal welfare, whether it's health for my body, what am I willing to pay for those things?
Todd, how does transparency fit into the master plan for Hungry Planet?
Yeah, well, I think John just hit on the three areas when we think about transparency. And what we find from our consumers, they're really interested in the environmental footprint of what we do and how it compares to the alternatives that are there. They're interested in the human health and exactly how does this food work in their body. And then they're also interested in the issues of animal welfare, animal protection. And so when they're thinking about our food and they're asking us about transparency, they're looking at those three different buckets, and we're happy to share with them how our food plays in each of those three different spaces.
Got it. Food security. We've heard a lot about it today, and I just wanted to see what you folks think about food security, kind of maybe food security strategy or food security in the future. Todd, I know you just got back from a trip around the world. I'm going to come back to you last on this one. But Beth, we've heard stories of students who don't have access to food, which to me was a little bit of a surprise. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
You heard from some of our earlier. It's biggest in the community colleges and the state colleges, but it certainly exists in the private schools as well. There's a number of student campaigns nationally to swipe against hunger. I work at a Catholic Jesuit school, so you can, more than 70% of our students are involved in service, so they're very passionate about it and are always coming to us with these really great ideas of either on campus or with the charities they're working with in Boston. We do a food salvage program similar to what you heard about with Harvard, where students package leftovers, et cetera. So we have several initiatives in those areas and are always willing to partner and try to come up with new and innovative ideas.
Great. John?
I mean, the only two things I would mention for sure at Applegate, very important to us. We're a part of the Hormel family of companies, and for Hormel, this has been one of the big wins for us as Applegate. A few years ago, we became a part of Hormel as their focus on food security and hunger relief and helping people in need. From an Applegate perspective, we do everything we can not to waste product and to get it in the hands of people who need it. But the other thing that's sort of interesting is we work with a local company in the New Jersey, Pennsylvania area who salvages distressed crops that need to be harvested immediately or will be lost. And so we'll go out and work with them and try to get those crops harvested, just get hands in the fields and try to help with that as well as another kind of answer to how we can help.
That's cool. Todd, you as mentioned, you just got back from a trip around the world. What do you think about the potential effects of widespread food insecurity on large populations?
I guess the way that we've looked at this in terms of it being a global issue, when people are looking at the demographics around the world, right now we've got a global population of about 7.8 billion people. By 2050, it's projected that we'll be close to 9 billion, which is an increase of about 25%. And so the experts who study this suggest that as we go from 7.8 to 9.5 billion, and that increase of about 25%, as prosperity increases around the world, people want to eat differently. And so the burden that that puts on the food supply chain is enormous. So while it's a 25% increase in population, the expectation is that as a food industry, we're going to have to increase our output by 50 to 100%. That's extraordinary, particularly when you realize that we have about 60 harvests left. So how are we going to make that happen? And when you look at the booming economies of places like China, I first went there in 1987 when it was largely an agrarian society. They've got 1.2 to 1.3 billion people in China. Although the demographers in Beijing, at least 15 years ago, when I met with somebody who'd been meeting with them, wasn't sure if they had 1.2 to 1.3 or 1.7 to 1.8. So let that sink in. A rounding error for them is larger than the population of the United States, right? So when you've got those kind of uncertainties out there, but we know that the world is becoming more prosperous, and as it becomes more prosperous, people want to eat, higher on the food chain, that degrades our soil faster, and it puts us all at risk. So there's some big challenges here. In 2009, Nestle did a private report, shared it with the U.S. government. It then didn't become private, although it was supposed to be. And what it showed was that based on...
Well, then how did it get out?
Well...
Or how'd you see it?
Well, someone notified me that it was on WikiLeaks. It's out there. And what they were showing was they were studying water, and they were trying to understand what was going on with the world's water supply. And what they were telling the U.S. government was that we were on a crash course with disaster, and that in the year 2000, when the global population was about 6 billion people, if everybody had eaten the way that we in the West ate, we would have consumed all the fresh water on the planet. So we're now at 7.8, and people are wanting to eat more and more like us. So whether it's topsoil or whether it's fresh water, those who are really diving into the data are setting off the alarm bells and saying, on a global basis, you've got serious problems, and you need to figure out how to address it. So when we look at food insecurity, we're looking at not just what's happening today in small communities, but what's happening globally, and trying to figure out how can we help bend that curve in a slightly different way.
That was fun.
Does that make you feel better, Josh?
Not exactly. If I hadn't been at this conference for the last 2 days, I would feel really bad. But having heard what I've heard here, I'm still hopeful. I still have a little bit hope left. John, have fun following that one. Do you have any apocalyptic visions for us?
I don't have apocalyptic vision, but I would say, it's all points very well made in terms of the population growth happening globally, the disposable income on the rise, people looking for more protein, more food. But the other compounding issue in that is this urbanization piece, which is pressuring space and land also, right? So if you look at the United States, between 1992 and 2012, in that 20 years, we lost 31 million acres of usable farmland. And the two sources of that was sprawl coming out of the cities and development happening in less dense areas, but still development and building, right? So a lot of conversion of farmland to residential and commercial properties. And so that pressures the system as well. So you think about those 2 billion people who are coming, they all need to live somewhere too. So in addition to having more money for more protein and food, they have more money for space and housing, and where are they all going to fit? So the biggest concern I would have on all of that is, so now we have more people who want more food, we have less land. That's the kind of thing that can lead you to bad practices in terms of how you treat the land, because then it becomes about output and how do we get more out of the land we have, right? So we're going to need to double, essentially, the output from the land we have to reach all of that. So I think it really puts a burden and the opportunity for all of us is how do we continue to look for innovative solutions that do allow us to employ technology, employ new thinking, right, and figure out ways to actually not denigrate the system, but build a healthier, more holistic system. Coming at it from different angles, I don't think any one of these things is going to work. What gives me hope is I do think there are a lot of innovative ideas and creative people who, when applied to this challenge, we can do it, right?
People think that futurism is all fun, but you see what we deal with on a daily basis. Beth, please.
So yesterday,
give us some hope here.
I was in Amherst, Massachusetts, at UMass at the Farm to Institution conference, where many of my colleagues are talking about the New England Food Solution Vision, which is 50% of our food will be produced in New England by 2060, which is hard to imagine.
And what's it called?
50 by 60.
There it is.
But we also realize, and this was all institutions at this conference, so it was healthcare, it was K-12, universities, et cetera, and that we have tremendous influence in institutions in terms of purchasing, but also in the educational setting in terms of educating, in using our dining areas and our restaurants as living laboratories. So they're learning a lot of this in the classroom, but we're touching them at least twice a day. And when they come in, how do we help them make good decisions about what they eat? One, for their bodies, but two, for their environment. So I think we have a great opportunity to impact this.
So it's going to get to 50% of
50%
food
produced,
supplies
right,
for
for New
consumed
England.
by New England will
Right.
be produced in New England. And where are we now?
50.
How far do we have to go?
I don't know the stat. I want to say it's 20, if that.
All right, got a little ways to go.
Less?
Lower.
Anybody know?
All right. Well, that was still
It's still a big
it's
goal.
still
Yeah.
uplifting, right? That at least there's an effort. There's
There's an effort.
a plan that has a name. 50 by 60. Everybody get on the 50 by 60 train and make this thing work, please. All right, so that was actually great, the way that we flowed into the scary stuff right there, sort of organically, but inorganically, I'd like each of you to take 15 to 30 seconds and talk about one small change that the people at this conference can make that you think could lead to a big impact. Let's start with John.
So I guess my plea would be, everybody I think is in various places in terms of how close you are to your food. My plea to everyone would be get one step closer to where your food comes from. We as a society have become so removed, and we're all trying to get back. And I think wherever you are on that journey, when you come out of here, get one step closer. For me, one step closer recently was visiting a regenerative farm that was employing regenerative practices, and to see the soil health coming back, to see things going from brown to green, to see biodiversity reintroduced into an environment that had been stripped of it was enlightening, right? So that was my kind of lesson as I got closer back to where our food comes from, and that's the one thing I would ask everyone to do, is do something to learn about where your food is coming from, because it just helps us all be smarter and find better solutions.
Awesome. Beth?
So for me, we all of us have something to do with food in this room, and are either, and it could be your guests, your students, your customers, your employees. I think it's really mentoring and encouraging people with the passion to change the world. I mean, I have this great fortune to work with smart, passionate students that inspire me every day, and they come up with these incredible ideas that you're saying, oh, how the heck am I going to do this, right? But then they inspire you to change, and I think we all of us in this room have that opportunity to continue to encourage and inspire people to change.
Fantastic. Todd?
I would suggest that you focus on giving delicious food and delicious experiences, but find ways to include in there more plant protein, whether it's a blended burger like what John has released, or what Impossible Beyond and we are doing, which is offering a full suite of plant-based meats. And if that's even just one meal a week, the change on a global basis in terms of the environmental and human health footprint is absolutely massive. And that's going to have a bigger change, in my mind, than anything else, is to find ways to take plant proteins and integrate them into conventional foods, where it's not a sacrifice, but simply, a switch, and the diners really won't know the difference, or they'll actually think that's a better experience than what they've had traditionally.
So go flexitarian.
Absolutely.
All right. Great. Well, we've got, I think, a little bit of time for questions. My predecessor this morning was pretty handy with the mic, but Garrett, you got that one? Okay. My legs have fallen asleep, so thanks, G.
Thank you all. This has been great. I have a question, and I've been noodling about this for the past couple of panels. We in America and other prosperous countries, we don't spend a lot of money on food. Therefore, very often, people don't know what the true cost of food is. What can each of you in your respective roles, which I understand are bound in by the reality of business, do to create more of an awareness of what the true cost is of producing food in this country?
I mean, it's a great question. From an Applegate perspective, you know, the journey the company has been on has been to actually get people closer, because I think that's a big part of it, to understand what is the impact on animals, community, farmers, and your health, right? So education is a big part of it. We want to continue on that path and make sure we're being sort of, you know, obviously we're trying to sell Applegate products, but a big part of what we're doing is trying to be as transparent and education-based and fact-based as we can, and let that steer the consumer, let that steer us to better solutions for them. So we're going to continue to do that, but it's hard, you know, and you have consumers who are in all different places in terms of their understanding and their interest. So it's about creating pockets of that demand where people are wanting to learn and have the aptitude to learn and get a little bit deeper, and then meeting their needs.
Yeah, and I think what we're finding is that in today's digital world, whether it's podcasts or whether it's YouTube videos, there's so much information out there right now that is driving the conversation. That more often than not, we find that it's not so much us out there talking, but people coming to us because they're starting to draw that connection between human health and what you eat. We're working with a 7-unit hospital chain right now. We started working with them about halfway through last year, and their objective, not at our product, but because of their research, was to go entirely plant-based throughout the entire hospital chain by the end of last year, and they almost got there. Because as a community, they started to realize, you know, here we are fixing people up from all sorts of problems that they have because of their food choices, right? I mean, a Twinkie is delicious, but it probably shouldn't be the center of your plate, right? Not that it is, but there are a lot of food choices that people make every single day that aren't nourishing their bodies in a proper way. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of that. And so we're just one voice out there, and we're trying to provide solutions that as people get educated about that, we're there to give them a solution instead of them being very aware that there's a problem, but they don't know how to solve it.
Beth, Emery, are your students getting a clear picture of how much food
It's
actually
not
costs?
even the students. It's even us as the leaders of a large budget, you know, on campus, and certainly universities expecting you to, you know, meet your financial obligations. Is how do you bring some of these great things that we want to do and still meet your financial commitments to the university? And there's a couple ways you can do it. It's one way, at least at our location, because we price everything like restaurant items, so we can price things more. So if we want to bring a new item or we want to source from just this one farmer, we can charge more, and we can explain to the students why. And many of them are okay with that and are willing to pay more. But then there's those students that you want to be able to access that can't. So that's, you know, that was one of our other topics, right, this morning. So it's tricky, and it's just managing your budget and trying to make the best decisions that you can, but also educating the students about the business. I'm leaving here to go back to our dining advisory board tonight from 6 to 7. I have over 30 student organizations represented. We explain the business of running a large department and how we make decisions, and they are just, oh, that's why you charge me so much for that burger. Oh, that's why it's the same price as Panera. And obviously we're paying our folks because we're a Jesuit Catholic school, and we believe we should be paying our people good wage, and they should have a guaranteed work week. We explain that all so that they understand that. But you're right. I mean, we don't pay a lot in this country for food.
Hi, our think tank just finished a pilot with Adelphi University. Students were able to take monies left on their meal cards and buy feminine products with them and donate them to the at-large combines that are on Long Island. And we're just recommending that to all universities that give the students a choice that if they have funds left at the end of a semester, they can use that to help with anti-poverty projects.
Very cool. Any more questions? All right. I think we're good. All right. So everybody go and solve this problem, and we'll meet you back here in a year. Thank you.